Welcome. This is the third part of my Grand Solar Minimum Deception series, which is called Denying the Obvious. In part one, we saw that Grand Solar Minimum News had created a completely fictitious story about me, which had nothing to do with Grand Solar Minima, the sun, or climate, and was therefore just a part of character assassination. And one wonders why they feel they have to do that. Perhaps they're feeling threatened. Part two, I showed that they had given us a graph that was from a dubious source and out of date. If you use the up-to-date version, it doesn't show what Grand Solar Minimum News claimed, which was that the modern temperatures are lower than the Roman period, and also that there was no cooling from 2014 onwards. The revised version by the same authors showed that temperatures in fact went up, not down. And secondly, that they are now admitting that carbon dioxide has a role in this increased temperature, which is something that Grand Solar Minimum News doesn't want you to hear. Okay, what is denying the obvious about then? Well, this is where they've taken great pains to avoid using data that is freely available to everybody and draw the exact opposite conclusion from what that data is showing. Their contention is that solar cycle 25 is not outperforming solar cycle 24. So let's take a look and see what is actually happening. Here's a plot of the sunspot number, one of the indicators of solar activity, over the last 13 years. And what they did was to draw a line back from the current level of the sunspot number, that's the monthly average sunspot number, and point out that some time ago the previous cycle was well above it, so therefore we are not outperforming the solar cycle. Well, anybody can play that game. For example, you could go to this peak here and say, well, look, the sunspot number is well down from there, therefore we're underperforming. Or you could choose another point and say, oh, look, we're up, and therefore the sunspot number is outperforming solar cycle 24. We don't know what the time constant for solar cycle 25 is, so we don't know how far we had to go back to do comparison by just drawing straight lines back from the current value. What you need is a reference point, and the reference point that I use, because it's the one stable thing and determined for both cycles at the moment, is the solar minimum. The solar minimum between solar cycle 23 and 24 happened in December 2008. The solar minimum between solar cycle 24 and solar cycle 25 happened in December 2019. So we have two reference points that we can measure everything from. So I'll measure the parameters from solar cycle 24 from that first minimum, and we'll measure the parameters of solar cycle 25 from the second minimum and see how they compare. So the question we're trying to answer is the solar cycle 25 maximum going to be larger than the maximum for solar cycle 24? Is it going to be about the same as NOAA and NASA claim? Or is it going to be less, as the proponents of the Grand Solar Minimum claim? And they're going to claim that it's very much less. I think the largest estimate for this coming cycle from those that are talking about Grand Solar Minima are about 80. And you'll notice we're already at that level and we're not yet at maximum. So first let's take a look at the two most common measures of solar activity. That's the sunspot number and the F10.7 centimeter flux. And both of those parameters are outperforming the model of solar cycle 25. Let me explain what the graph is first. The blue curve with the dots on it are the monthly average sunspot numbers. The purple curve written underneath that is the smooth sunspot number. That's the monthly average sunspot numbers smoothed over a period of 13 months. And the red curve is the prediction for solar cycle 25 using the typical shape of a solar cycle, and with the estimate of NASA and NOAA saying that solar cycle 25 may be about the same or slightly larger than solar cycle 24. And as you can see, the sunspot number, that's the top frame here, is outperforming the model by over a factor of 2. The same is true for the 10.7 centimeter flux. So for solar cycle 25 now, it's well ahead of the predictions of the experts. Now, these sunspot numbers fluctuate a lot, and most cycles have multiple peaks. But at the moment, we're well ahead of where we were in the previous cycle and well ahead of the models. One way of comparing the relative activity levels in the two cycles is to count the number of major sunspot regions that have appeared since solar minimum in each case. And NOAA does this for us by numbering the major regions. And so all we have to do is look at the number of regions per month, and that tells us how the two cycles are performing. The orange curve here is solar cycle 25, and the blue curve is solar cycle 24. And you can see for the first 18 months of solar cycle 25, it's basically indistinguishable from solar cycle 24. The error bars of the two overlap. After that, the solar cycle 25 numbers start to pull away, and they start becoming significantly different after about 2 years. And you can see that the gap has steadily widened and is threatening to widen further if they follow the current trajectories. So here again we have another parameter, the number of major regions, that solar cycle 25 is distinctly outperforming solar cycle 24. Another parameter is the number of flares, and I'm going to break this down into C flares, M flares, and X flares. And interestingly enough, we get slightly different results for each one of them. Once again here for C flares, that's the smallest of the major flare categories, the two are indistinguishable for about the first 18 months. So they have a very similar initial evolution. But soon after that, a solar cycle 25 starts to pull away quite fast, and now is outperforming solar cycle 24 by a factor of 2. We've had over 1,000 C flares from solar cycle 25, where by this stage we'd had barely 600 from solar cycle 24. Well, M flares are the next largest category, and they are 10 times larger than the C flares. So I was actually expecting them to have the identical evolution, but they don't. In fact, initially solar cycle 24 was more active than solar cycle 25. Solar cycle 25 by comparison has a steady increase from the first year onwards, and is now recently pulled away quite significantly from solar cycle 24. It's taken the lead by about 30% over solar cycle 24, and it looks as though that lead is going to be extended if current activity levels continue. But I do not understand why it would be so different from C flares. The largest category of flares are X flares. They are 10 times larger than the equivalent M flares. Solar cycle 25 has been dominant from the start in this, as you can see. Solar cycle 25 pulled away from solar cycle 24 after about 18 months and has not relinquished the lead since. We do have to be aware here of the statistics of small numbers. As of the end of April, we had 6 X flares from solar cycle 25 and only 2 X flares from solar cycle 24. While that's a factor of 3, it's still very small numbers, and one region can come along and produce a bunch of X flares and even this out in a few days. But nonetheless, solar cycle 25 is more active in terms of X flares than solar cycle 24. There's no getting away from that. Another good measure of how active a solar cycle is the number of coronal mass ejections it produces. For the first 18 months, once again, the two cycles were indistinguishable. In fact, I'd say probably up until about 2 years. Solar cycle 25, since that point, has been trying to pull away and has now established a significant difference between it and solar cycle 24. So let's summarize. All the parameters used to measure solar cycle activity, solar cycle 25 has shown to be more active than solar cycle 24. Sunspot number, it's leading by a factor of 2.3, F10.7, 2.4, numbered regions by about 30%, C flares by a factor of 2, M flares by about 30%, X flares by a factor of 3, and CMEs by a factor of 20%. Now, I've got an asterisk against the X flares, because in the last couple of days, while I was producing this video, we've had 2 more X flares from solar cycle 25, and therefore that puts it 8-2 ahead of solar cycle 24, so it's a factor of 4. Now that's beginning to become significant, and so I think we can safely say that the X flares are pulling ahead in a significant way, just like some of the other parameters. I find it interesting that many of the grand solar minimum advocates are now switching to 2031 and beyond for the beginning of the grand solar minimum. It seems they've lost faith in solar cycle 25. And remember, 10 years before, they were giving the same story about solar cycle 24, and that didn't pan out too well either. So thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and goodbye.